initial intent was to offer up a mindfulness activity, a meditation called Metta. I've done that before on here, but I thought it would be a nice time to do that one again. But then a video came across my radar. It was Steve Gleason, who was an American football player, safety, and he received the Arthur Ashe Award for courage at the ESPYs. He has ALS. Every day of his life is a struggle, but he still finds a way to maintain as positive an outlook as somebody could maintain. Fantastic role model for his children and loving husband. He's raised millions of dollars to help get equipment for people with ALS who need it. And I listened to his words, and there was a part in it, for all his positivity and everything he has. In the middle of the speech, he said, for those of you who have never felt fear, isolation, and suffering, take your sanctimonious asses out of here. Because we all feel those things to some degree. And I know that I have a tendency to come on here with positive messages, with upbeat insight, but at the same time, never mistake that I have definitely felt fear. I've had times that I feel very isolated in my life. And I know from the Buddhist studies I've done, I create my own suffering. And I'll circle back to that a little bit. But it's a thought I definitely had. And I wanted to first visit a Stoic quote that I thought fit this perfectly. This comes from Marcus Aurelius. And it says, people look for retreats for themselves in the country, by the coast, or in the hills. There's nowhere that a person can find a more peaceful and trouble-free retreat than in their own mind. And it's very true words. We always look to distractions. We look to things that are outside of us to bring us peace. It's finish the sentence. If I only had, then I would be. If I only had more money, then I'd be happy. If I only had a significant other, then I'd be happy. If I only had this certain job, then I'd be happy. And it can go on and on and on into whatever we think it might be. But the problem with that is all of those things are outside of us. So once we get them, we think we'll be happy. But then pretty soon, the newness of having that drifts away. So sure, we're happy in that instant that we get something. We get a brand new car, and we're thrilled as we're driving our new car. It's the greatest thing in the world. We're smiling until somebody gets a newer, more special car. And then all of a sudden, the newness of what we had wears off, and we can greedily look to them with that envy of saying, oh, I really wish I had what they had. So that pursuit is never ending, because we can never really get happiness coming from outside. I looked at that when I was teaching for years. And a parent would be somewhere, wherever it might be, and they would move their child down here because they thought where they were, whether it is Atlantic City or Philadelphia or wherever you want to imagine, that struggles with crime and struggles with addiction and all of those things that people don't think exist here when obviously they do. But the thought was moving my child away from that will stop his or her trouble. And the problem with that is, in that same instance, we're not dealing with that quality inside that's causing those troubles, that's causing that issue. So circling back on that idea of fear, It's the idea of looking at, okay, what is it I fear? Once I answer that question, can I realistically list what I can do to prevent what I fear from happening? If it's something that's completely out of my control, if there's nothing I can do, then my fear is really unsubstantiated because I can't control it. For instance, that fear of death. Okay, well, there's certain things I can do. I can take precautions, wear a seatbelt when I drive, not be crazy when I'm driving. I can eat well. I can exercise. I can get yearly checkups to make sure nothing's wrong. But having done all of that, there's factors I can't control. Somebody else's erratic driving, some kind of a genetic condition that I may be predisposed to. Well, for me to fear those things is really counterproductive because I'm hurting the time that I'm living. I'm hurting the time that I have because I fear something that may come, that may not come. Well, obviously death will always come, but that may be decades away. But instead I ruin the here and now and the time that I have. A simpler instance than that, I used to talk to my seniors. And one of the things I said as they got ready to go off to college, especially those who were in a significant relationship, and they would leave the high school in June and all summer worry about, are we going to make it when we're apart? What's it going to be like? And then it would create tension for that period of time in June, July, and early August before they both went to colleges. And what that did was they didn't enjoy the time they had together, fearing what would happen during the time they were apart. And again, there's things that are in our control and there's things that are outside of our control. Isolation is really one that scares me now more than ever for people because we tend to isolate ourselves. And I mean that we spend quite a bit of time in the online world. We spend quite a bit of time on social media thinking that we're a part of this really large group on social media, when in reality, we're isolated from those more intimate conversations that we can have in person and with somebody sitting across from us and the people around us. And keep in mind that isolation and being alone are two different things. In some cases, being alone is a very productive for whatever you're doing, your creativity, self-reflection, meditation, prayer. All of that works really well when you're alone, which is very different than isolation. Isolation can happen when we're in a whole group of people. Maybe it happens because we feel like we're the only one who thinks a certain way and everyone around us thinks a different way. And therefore, we feel very isolated in where we are because we feel like our thinking is so different, so radically different from everybody around us. And the last one that he brought up was suffering. And I said I was going to circle back. Suffering is a foundation when you look at Buddhist philosophy, because the Buddha loved lists. And the most basic list that he had was the Four Noble Truths. And in those Four Noble Truths, one of the things that came up was, the first of the Noble Truths was, life contains suffering. And it does. No matter what you do in life, there is a degree of suffering that's going to come along. What's important to realize is those moments of suffering are temporary. They're here for a moment, and then they pass on and go, and we come back to where we were. The Buddhist term was dukkha, which means pain, or something that's incapable of being satisfied causes suffering. So from there, and I always like the translation, I'm going to go back one. I always like the translation that life contains suffering. because some translations will say life is suffering. I've always been more, I think it's more direct to say that life contains suffering, that it's other things, but suffering is one part of it. Then you get to the cause of that suffering. And the cause of that suffering is honestly driven by an ignorance of reality. It comes from craving. We suffer because we want things. We're attached to things. And when I'm attached to something, I'm usually fearful that that thing will go away. I cling and I'm craving. Suffering also comes from the regret looking back at things that I can't change, but yet I hang on to them and I dwell on them and I let them run around. And finally, the end of suffering is the third of the noble truths. And the end of suffering is the idea of letting go of craving, letting go of desire. And it's a balance. It's not to say that you don't drive yourself to achieve something, that you don't work really hard to get to a certain level. When I was teaching, I always wanted to be the best at what I did. And obviously you can never be that. And I understood that, but I knew that I had to work hard in order to be the best teacher I could be for the students around me. And then finally, the last of the noble truths is there is a path toward a good life, which is the Eightfold Path. And I'm not going to dwell into the Eightfold Path, but I think it's a beautiful thing. I will dedicate an episode of the Mindful Classroom to talking about the Eightfold Path and how we can work within those confines in our life. But I think if we go back to Steve Gleason's talk, despite everything he's struggling with, the one thing that struck me watching a video on him was the biggest, one of the big losses he had was he can't move his arms. So he has 2 young children and he can no longer hug them. So rather than look at that as a point of suffering, he and his children came up with another variation to show adoration and love. They touch foreheads together and make eye contact while they're touching foreheads to have that closeness and that bond. There's a perfect example of how you can look at something you can't do and dwell on that and cause misery dwelling on that. Or you can look at something you can't do and say, okay, what can I do in its place? What can I do instead to continue living the life that I want to live? With that, I thought I would bring to a close with a passage from Epictetus on positive thinking. So as we look at these ideas, then we can come back to looking at how we can see the world. And he says, what kind of forlornness is left then to talk about? What kind of helplessness? Why make ourselves worse than little children? When they are left alone, what do? They gather up shards and dust and build something or other, and then tear it down and build something else again. And so they are never at a loss as how to spend their time. Am I then, if you set sail, to sit down and cry because I am left alone and forlorn in that fashion? Shan't I have shards? Shan't I have dust? And in that same sense, that's what I was addressing before. We have a choice. We can either look at what we've lost or what we don't have and focus on that and create a sense of misery because of that. Or we can reframe it and say, well, what can I do with what I have? And we're going to find a great deal more satisfaction and a great deal more joy and a great deal more gratitude in the world when we can step back and look at what we can do in this world, what we can make do, how we can satisfy that thing we think we're missing. So I will put a link up if you haven't seen Steve Gleason's talk. It's a beautiful talk. And I think it's a great lesson in seeing how we can find a sense of positivity no matter what circumstances are around us. And in the end, the biggest lesson becomes we can see the world the way we choose to see the world. So some people's lenses only see the negative that's around them. And no matter what happens to them, they look for the negative and they look for those qualities that create anxiety, isolation, fear, depression. Other people, no matter what's going on around them, find reasons to see the goodness, find reasons to be grateful, and find reasons to celebrate. So, my friends, have a beautiful day. If you get a chance, take a listen to the Steve Gleason ESPY speech. It is truly inspiring, motivating, and can help us to have a better outlook in the world around us. Have a wonderful day, and please join me tomorrow where I'm going to offer a meditation for us to share. Take care. Peace.